In a lonely frontier church, a young cowboy was bound to a woman twice his age, a marriage neither asked for but one that would change them forever. In the hush of a frontier night, a scarred cowboy faced a woman with a rifle at her side. Their marriage was born of duty, but destiny had other plans. The Caldwell Ranch lay miles from town, a lonely scatter of buildings huddled against the sweep of open prairie. The wagon wheels rattled over frozen ruts as Martha guided the horses, her hands steady on the reins. Elias sat stiff beside her, the silence pressing heavier than the winter sky. When the house came into view, Elias felt a pang he did not expect. It was no grand homestead, no thriving spread of wealth. The place bore the marks of long years and harder storms. A log house, with sagging roof beams, a barn leaning tired against the wind, corrals patched with mismatched boards. A few cattle grazed listlessly in the field, their ribs showing through shaggy winter coats. This was not prosperity. This was survival, barely. Martha pulled the team to a stop and climbed down, her boots crunching on frozen dirt. "Unload." "The wagon," she said, not unkindly, but with no hint of softness either. She moved with a quiet strength, carrying her share of the bundles despite her age. Elias obeyed, though his pride prickled. He had thought himself the man, the worker, the rescuer. Instead, it felt as though he were stepping into her world, not she into his. Inside the house, the air smelled of cedar, smoke, and something faintly sweet, like dried apples stored away long ago. The floorboards creaked under Elias's boots as he set his bag down in a narrow corner. The main room was spare, a stone hearth with ashes cold from mourning, a table scarred by knives, shelves of jars half filled with beans and preserves. And by the fire sat a rocking chair, worn smooth by years of use, its gentle sway moving as though stirred by ghosts. Elias paused, staring at it. The chair was empty, yet not empty. He could almost picture Martha's late husband sitting there, boots dusty, pipe in hand. Or perhaps Martha herself, younger then, her braid still dark, nursing her grief by firelight. The chair moved slightly with the draft, creaking softly, and Elias felt like an intruder in another man's home. Martha noticed his gaze but said nothing. She set about lighting the hearth, coaxing the flame with practiced hands. When firelight spread across the walls, she straightened and said, "You'll sleep in the loft. Take care with the ladder. It shifts some." Elias nodded, muttered a thanks he did not mean, and carried his bag upward. The loft was small, low-ceilinged, smelling of hay and dust. A thin mattress lay on a frame of rough boards. He sat there, a moment, listening to Martha moving below, her steps sure, her movement steady. This was no maiden's home awaiting her groom. This was a fortress of endurance, and he was no more than a hired hand with a ring on his finger. That first week passed in silence. Martha rose before dawn, stoking the fire, heating coffee in a dented pot. She set Elias to work mending fences, hauling water from the well, splitting wood for the hearth. She gave instructions without sharpness, but without kindness either, as though speaking to someone she neither disliked nor trusted. Elias obeyed, though resentment simmered beneath his skin. He was young, strong, capable, and yet she treated him no differently than she might treat a ranch hand bought for a season's wages. Evenings were the hardest. The winter winds moaned against the shutters, rattling them in their frames. Elias would sit at the table eating stew or beans, the silence thick enough to choke. Martha spoke only of what was necessary, which fence posts needed setting, which cow looked ready to calve, which supplies would have to be stretched until spring, and always, that rocking chair sat by the fire. Sometimes when the draft caught just right, it would sway gently, creaking in rhythm with the wind. Elias hated that sound. It reminded him of absence, of a life already lived and buried, of a space he would never fill. One evening, after a day of hauling water through half-frozen mud, Elias sank wearily onto the bench by the table. Martha poured him coffee, black and bitter, and sat across from him with her own cup. For a time they drank in silence, the fire snapping softly between them. Elias found his eyes drifting again to the rocking chair. Was it his? He asked suddenly, his voice rough. Martha followed his gaze. For the first time since the courthouse, her expression shifted. Not softened, but deepened, as if a shadow crossed her face. Yes, she said. James sat there most nights. After long days on the range, Elias hesitated. You never moved it? Her eyes returned to the fire. Some things belong to the house. They stay, even when people don't. Her words lingered in the air, heavy, unyielding. Elias had no reply. He drained his cup, set it down too hard, and retreated to the loft where the rafters groaned in the cold. Yet later, as he lay on the thin mattress listening to the wind whistle through the chinks, he thought of Martha's words. Some things belong to the house. He turned them over in his mind like stones in a river, worn smooth but impossible to ignore. Days stretched on. He began to notice things he had not before. The way Martha's hands, cracked and reddened from work, moved carefully when mending a tear in her shawl. The way she paused each morning by the window, watching the horizon as though waiting for something that never came. The way she spoke to the cattle in low tones, not harsh, not tender, but steady, as if promising them she would not abandon them. Elias found himself watching, listening, though he told himself he did not care. In truth, he was beginning to see her not as punishment, not as a gray specter of his shame, but as a figure carved out of endurance. Her silence was not emptiness. It was armor, worn from years of holding a world together alone. One night, when the wind rose wild and the rocking chair began to sway, Elias did not turn away. He watched its creak and shadow, the empty rhythm of it, and wondered if perhaps it did not mock him at all. Perhaps it was only the sound of time itself, rocking, on whether he wished it to or not. The courthouse stood at the edge of the small Wyoming town, its wooden frame weathered and groaning under the weight of prairie winds. Dust whirled in lazy spirals across the street, catching on wagon wheels and boot heels, clinging to the hems of dresses. Inside, the air was still, heavy with the smell of old pine boards, ink, and tobacco smoke that clung stubbornly to the rafters. Elias Mercer sat on the bench at the front, hat clutched tight in his calloused hands. He was 23, shoulders broad from ranch work, eyes still carrying the restless fire of youth. But that fire had burned reckless. Cards and whiskey had taken his nights, anger had taken his fists. He had left one man bloodied and broken outside the saloon only weeks before, and debts lay like chains around his neck. The judge, a stern man whose beard was as gray as the clapboards outside, leaned forward. His voice was low, tired, like one who had seen too many young men throw their futures away. Prison or banishment is what most would say, he told Elias, his words echoing off the bare walls. But this town has little use for another ghost or outlaw. There is another way, should you accept it. Elias raised his eyes, wary. And what way would that be, sir? A murmur rippled through the small gathering of townsfolk who had come to watch. The judge cleared his throat and read from a paper. Martha Caldwell, widow of James Caldwell, has petitioned this court. Her ranch is failing. She has no sons, no kin to stand by her. She requires a man's name beside hers, and she is willing to take yours in marriage, should you vow to tend her land and honor her household. Elias felt the words strike like a hammer. Martha Caldwell. Everyone in town knew her. A woman. Nearing 55, her hair long since gone to gray, her face stern as the land she tilled. She had buried a husband 20 years her senior, carried on alone, and was known to drive cattle with more grit than half the men at the stockyard. She had no children, no softness about her, only a reputation for hard work and a sharp tongue. To wed her? Elias said, the words scraping his throat. The judge's gaze was steady. Better than chains. Better than running till you die, thirsty in the desert. It is marriage, Elias Mercer, or exile. The choice lies with you. Laughter flickered from the benches behind, a cruel, mocking chuckle from one of the men Elias had once played cards with. The humiliation burned hot in his chest. To be bound to a woman 30 years older, a widow with creased hands and weather-beaten eyes. It felt like punishment dressed as mercy. Yet when Elias's eyes met Martha's, standing tall at the back of the room in her plain gray dress, he saw no laughter there. Her face held neither triumph nor shame, only resolve. Her shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and her hands rested calmly on a folded hymn book. She regarded him as though measuring not his pride, but his willingness to endure. Thruwang. Silence in the room thickened. Elias thought of the road beyond town, the endless plains, the thin line of horizon where outlaws wandered nameless. He thought of prison walls, of iron cuffs, of years wasted. And then he thought of the house he might one day build, the horses he had dreamed of breaking, the cattle he might raise if he ever steadied himself. His jaw clenched. "I'll take the vow." The crowd whispered, some scoffing, some muttering in surprise. Martha merely inclined her head as though she had expected nothing less. The wedding was swift, stripped of romance. A preacher summoned, vows spoken in voices that carried no tremor, only necessity. The ring slid onto her finger, an old band from her first marriage, repurposed for this second union. Elias muttered the words of promise as if speaking across a canyon, his voice hollow. Martha's reply was firm, steady, without hesitation. When the preacher closed the Bible, the town scattered, whispering and chuckling into the street. Elias felt their eyes on his back like needles. He stepped outside, the sun harsh, dust curling at his boots. Martha walked beside him, her shawl pulled close against the wind. They did not touch. They did not smile. There was no kiss, no laughter, no music. Only the sound of wagon wheels creaking as someone passed and the caw of a crow circling overhead. At the edge of town, Elias stopped and looked out at the horizon. The land stretched endless, brown and gold under the dying sun. The future felt like that horizon, empty, uncertain, demanding. Martha turned her gaze toward him, her gray braid catching the light. "Best we head home," she said simply. Her voice carried no malice, no welcome, only fact. Elias nodded, though his throat was dry. He climbed into the wagon beside her, the bench hard, the air cold. As the horses started forward, the town shrinking behind them, Elias thought of the vow he had just taken. He felt as though he had buried his youth in that courthouse, laid it to rest beside Martha Caldwell's first husband. The wagon rolled into the vastness of the plains, the silence between them as wide as the prairie sky. Yet in that silence, beneath the dust and the shame, something stirred faintly. The faintest whisper that perhaps this was not an end, but the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. The first snow came early that year, drifting across the plains in silent veils, blanketing the sagebrush and fences with a brittle whiteness. By dawn, the Caldwell Ranch lay hushed under the weight of winter, the sky pale as bleached bone. Elias woke to the sound of wind clawing at the shutters, the air in the loft biting cold despite the fire Martha had kept alive through the night. He pulled on his boots, stiff with frost, and descended the ladder. Martha was already at the stove, shawl drawn tight over her shoulders, hands red from the chill. She poured coffee into a tin cup and slid it across the table without a word. Her face was drawn but steady, her braid coiled like iron down her back. "We'll need to break the ice in the troughs," she said, her voice flat as the wind outside. "Cattle won't last if they can't drink." Elias drank deeply, the coffee bitter, warming his chest. He nodded and pulled on his coat. That day tested them both. The cold was merciless, the kind that seeped into bones and hollowed out strength. The fences groaned under the snow's weight, drifts rising higher than Elias's knees. He swung the axe into frozen troughs until his arms burned, shards of ice flying like glass. Martha worked beside him, hauling buckets, her breath ragged in the air. She was slower than he, but her endurance startled him. She did not complain, did not falter. She moved as though winter were another adversary she had learned to outlast. By noon, Elias noticed her steps dragging, her face pale beneath the windburn. He urged her to rest, but she shook her head. "Work doesn't wait on weariness," she said, her voice sharp but trembling at the edges. The words haunted him as the day wore on. He had thought her unbending, made of stone, yet here she was, mortal, aging, yet refusing to bow. It was near sundown when it happened. They were out by the river fence, snow swirling in a blinding haze, when Martha staggered. The bundle of firewood slipped from her arms, scattering into the snow. She tried to right herself, but her knees buckled. "Martha!" Elias shouted, lunging forward. He caught her just before she crumpled, her body frighteningly light in his arms. Her breath came shallow, her lips bluish with cold. For a moment, fear gripped him. Raw, unfamiliar fear, sharper than any fight he'd faced in town. He lifted her and carried her back to the house, each step sinking into drifts, his muscles screaming with effort. Snow whipped against his face, stinging his eyes, but he pressed on, her shawl flapping against his chest like a flag in retreat. Inside, he laid her gently near the hearth and stoked the fire until flames leapt high, throwing shadows across the room. He stripped off her wet boots, wrapped her in blankets, and pressed the tin cup of coffee to her lips. She sipped weakly, eyes half closed, her hands trembling in his. Elias stared at those hands. They were cracked and calloused, the nails broken, the skin ridged with scars. Scars from rope burns, from knives, from years of holding the ranch together alone. He realized then how much labor those hands had endured, how many winters they had carried without faltering. And yet, even hands of stone could tire. He stayed by her side that night, feeding the fire, listening to her breathing grow steadier. When at last her eyes opened fully, they met his in the flicker of firelight. "You should have let me be," she whispered. Elias shook his head. "And watch you freeze where you stood?" "No, Martha. Not while I'm here." Something flickered in her gaze, not gratitude, not softness, but a faint surprise, as though she had forgotten what it felt like to be guarded. The silence between them shifted. It was no longer a canyon dividing two strangers. It was something narrower, something fragile, like the ice forming on the river, breakable, yet binding if it held. The next morning, Martha rose slowly, her movements careful, but her eyes clearer. She did not thank him, yet she poured his coffee with a steadier hand. That small act carried more weight than words. Days passed, snow deepened. Elias worked harder, taking more of the burden, driving posts into frozen ground, repairing the barn, door battered by wind. Martha guided him when he faltered, her knowledge sharper than any man's. Together they weathered the storm, their survival no longer separate, but bound in quiet reliance. One afternoon, as Elias repaired a fence near the river, he paused to watch the current winding beneath the ice. The water moved slowly, bending around stones, reshaping itself against the land's command. He thought of Martha then, of how her life had bent around loss, around loneliness, yet continued to flow. She was not broken. She had simply learned to bend without ceasing. That night, as they sat by the fire, Martha's braid loosened, strands of gray hair falling free. Elias found himself studying the lines of her face, the quiet dignity she carried. She was not beautiful in the way of young women he had once courted in town, but there was a fierceness in her, the kind of beauty carved by time and weather, like cliffs along a riverbank. For the first time, Elias felt no shame in being tied to her. Instead, he felt something closer to reverence. When he climbed the ladder to the loft, he glanced back at the rocking chair. It sat still that night, unmoved by draft or wind. He wondered if perhaps the ghosts had settled, content for now. And, as he lay on the thin mattress, the sound of the river beneath ice echoed in his mind, steady and relentless. He understood then that he was no longer a prisoner in this house, nor in this vow. He was a man learning the shape of endurance, and, in Martha's presence, he was beginning to change. The winter night lay heavy upon the land, moonlight dim behind a shroud of clouds. The snow had hardened into crust beneath the stars, and the wind cut sharp through the cottonwoods by the river. In the house, the fire burned low, its glow painting the walls in amber light. Elias sat at the table, sharpening a blade, the rhythmic scrape steady against the silence. Martha rocked gently in her chair, shawl pulled close, her gaze far away. Then came the sound. Faint at first, carried on the wind. The crunch of hooves where none should be, the low murmur of men. Elias stiffened. He knew the sound of riders moving with stealth. He rose, reaching for the rifle propped by the door. His eyes flicked to Martha, expecting alarm, but found only a stillness in her face, as if she too had known such nights before. She rose from the rocker without a word and pulled open a drawer, laying a pouch of cartridges on the table. Her movements were practiced, calm. "They'll be after the cattle," she said, her voice low but steady. "They always are when snow runs deep." Elias checked the rifle, sliding around into the chamber. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. The hoofbeats grew clearer now, circling near the barn. Shadows flitted against the snow, tall and crooked in the moonlight. Elias's heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He glanced again at Martha, expecting her to retreat, to seek shelter. Instead, she took up another rifle from the corner, the wood worn smooth from years of use. She moved to the window, lifted the curtain with the barrel, and peered into the dark. "You take the south side," she murmured. "I'll cover the barn door." Elias hesitated. "You mean to fight?" Her eyes, gray as storm clouds, cut to him. "This is my land, Elias Mercer. I've stood guard alone more nights than I can count. Tonight I don't stand alone." The words struck him like flint sparking tinder. He nodded once and stepped out into the night. The cold bit sharp as teeth. Snow crunched under his boots as he moved to the south fence, rifle ready. The barn loomed ahead, shadows shifting around its walls. A man's voice hissed orders, followed by the creak of wood as someone tried the latch. "Leave the latch be," Elias shouted, his voice cracking the silence like a whip. The shadows froze. One figure turned, pistol glinting. A shot rang out, shattering the night. Elias ducked, snow exploding near his boots. He raised his rifle and fired. The crack echoed across the valley, and one shadow crumpled into the drift. Chaos erupted. Hoofbeats thundered. Men shouting curses. Another figure lunged toward the corral, rope in hand. Elias aimed again, but before he could fire, Martha's rifle spoke from the house. The man spun and fell, the snow blooming dark beneath him. Elias felt a jolt of awe. Her shot had been clean, certain. No hesitation, no falter. The remaining riders turned, retreating into the night, their curses fading into the wind. Silence fell again, broken only by the labored breaths of man and beast. The cattle stirred in the barn, lowing nervously, but none had been taken. Elias lowered his rifle, his hands trembling now that the danger had passed. He looked toward the house. Martha stood in the doorway, rifle still in hand, firelight at her back. The snow swirled around her like smoke, her shawl whipping in the wind. She looked not like a frail widow, but like a sentinel carved from the very land itself. When he returned inside, stamping snow from his boots, she was already reloading. Her face calm, though her breath came hard. Elias laid his rifle on the table and studied her in the flickering glow. For the first time, he did not see age in her lines or weariness in her hands. He saw strength, sharp and unyielding, the kind forged only through years of standing alone against storms. "You shot true," he said quietly. She glanced up, the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. "I've had practice." They sat, in silence a while, the fire crackling between them, the scent of gunpowder clinging to the air. Elias poured them both coffee, his hands steady now. He handed her a cup, their fingers brushing briefly. She accepted it, eyes unreadable, but she did not pull away. For the rest of the night, the rocking chair stayed still, as though even the ghosts held their breath. When Elias finally lay in the loft, he stared at the rafters long into the dark. The image of Martha standing in the doorway burned in his mind, Rifle in hand, shawl in the wind, unflinching before danger. He felt pride then, not shame, at being bound to her. For the first time since the courthouse, he understood. He had not been chained to weakness. He had been given the chance to stand beside someone whose strength matched his own. Sleep came slow, but when it did, it was deep. The kind that follows a battle survived, and a truth uncovered. By spring, the snow melted from the riverbanks, leaving the earth slick with mud and new shoots of green. The river, once trapped beneath ice, now ran swift and loud, carrying with it the roar of thaw and change. The Caldwell Ranch breathed again. Calves stumbled in the pastures, wildflowers pushed through thawing soil, and the days grew long with labor. Elias worked the land with renewed purpose. He mended the barn roof, its shingles rattled loose by winter storms, and dug new fence posts where the frost had cracked the old. Martha labored beside him, slower now, her breath short after long hours, but her will no less steady. Their silence had shifted, no longer sharp, no longer strangers speaking across a canyon. It was the silence of companions who needed few words. One morning, Elias found her sitting by the porch, patching an old work glove with twine. A small ribbon, faded blue, lay on the step beside her. He picked it up without thinking. It was frayed at the edges, the color dulled by years. "You wore this?" he asked. Martha looked up, her eyes narrowing faintly. "When I was a girl. James kept it once, tied to the saddle horn." She reached for it, then hesitated, letting her hand fall back to her lap. It served its time. Elias studied it a moment, then tucked it into his pocket. That afternoon, while braiding new rope for the corral, he wove the ribbon into the cord. When he tied it off, the faded blue shimmered faintly among the strands. He left it coiled neatly on the porch, saying nothing. Martha found it that evening. She traced the braid with her fingers, her face unreadable, but when she set it aside, she did so with care, as if it were more than rope now. The weeks unfolded in rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch, evenings by the fire, the rocking chair creaking gently once more. They shared the burden of labor, the comfort of quiet meals, the strange peace that comes when two lives move in step without needing to name it. Then illness struck. It began with a cough in Martha's chest, faint at first, then ragged. By weeks, fever burned through her body. She tried to rise, to tend to the cattle, but her legs buckled beneath her weight. Elias carried her back to bed, his heart pounding with a fear he could not voice. For 3 nights he scarcely slept. He brought water from the river, cool against her brow. He read aloud from her Bible in a low, halting voice, though scripture had never been his habit. He cooked broth clumsily, spilling half of it, but coaxed her to drink. In her delirium, she whispered fragments of James of the ranch of years gone, and once she whispered, "I thought myself forgotten, unworthy of love." The words struck Elias like a blade. He sat there, her hand burning in his, and felt a weight shift inside him. This vow, once a shackle, was no punishment. It was a chance he had not deserved, a chance to give back to someone who had carried too much alone. By the 4th morning, her fever broke. She woke with her eyes clear, her face pale but alive. Elias was slumped in the chair by her bedside, head bowed, hands rough and dirty from labor. When he stirred awake, relief washed his face raw, unguarded. "You stayed," she murmured. "Of course I stayed." His voice caught. "Where else would I go?" Their eyes met then, not as strangers bound by law, but as two souls bound by something deeper, something chosen in silence. In the days that followed, Martha grew stronger. She returned to the porch, shawl over her shoulders, watching Elias work. One evening, as the sun sank red over the horizon, he joined her with 2 cups of coffee. They drank in silence, the rocking chair creaking, the river rushing faint beyond the fields. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a length of rope, the one with the ribbon braided in. He placed it in her lap. "Some things don't belong to the house," he said softly. Some things belong to the living. Her hand lingered on the rope, on the ribbon frayed yet unbroken. She said nothing, but her fingers trembled as they closed over it. That night, as they sat by the fire, the chair no longer seemed to hold ghosts. It was only wood now, worn and creaking, warmed by the blaze. Elias watched Martha's face in the firelight, the lines softened, her eyes gentler than he had ever seen them. He felt something unfamiliar rise in him, not the fiery hunger he had once known in youth, but something steadier, deeper, a peace that came from choosing to remain. The river outside rushed on, bending through the land, carrying the winter away. Elias thought of how it had endured ice, storm, and thaw, and still it moved, patient, unyielding. He understood now. Love was not always a blaze. Sometimes it was a river, steady, bending, carrying all things forward. Years unspooled like thread, quiet and steady. The Caldwell Ranch did not become grand, but it lived, and so did those who kept it. Grass grew thick in the pastures, calves fattened into cattle, and the river bent on, shaping the land as it always. Elias grew older. The fire of youth tempered into something gentler. His face bore the marks of sun and wind, his shoulders rounded from years of labor. Martha aged too, her once iron stride slower now, her braid thin and silver, her hands knotted with time. Yet her eyes remained sharp, and when she smiled, rare but true, it softened the whole room. Their life was marked not by grand declarations, but by small things. 2 cups of coffee steaming on the porch at dawn, the creak of the rocking chair beside the fire, the ribbon still braided in rope hanging by the barn door where it caught the sun. They spoke little, but their silence was no longer empty. It was full, steady, carrying the weight of years shared. 1. Spring. Martha grew frail. The work grew too heavy for her bones, and she spent more time on the porch, wrapped in shawls, her gaze fixed on the cottonwoods by the river. Elias carried the heavier burdens without complaint, though his own back ached, his hands swollen. In the evenings, he sat beside her, rocking gently, speaking little. She would reach for his hand sometimes, her grip weak but certain. As summer waned, her strength ebbed further. The day came when she asked Elias to take her down to the riverbank. He lifted her carefully into the wagon, the same wagon that had once carried them from town as strangers bound by law. Slowly, he guided the horses to the bend in the river where the cottonwoods grew tall, their leaves whispering in the wind. He laid a blanket on the grass and helped her down, her shawl trailing across the earth. She sat watching the water curve and shimmer in the sun. For a long time they said nothing, only listening to the river's steady song. "It bends here," Martha whispered at last, her voice thin. "Doesn't break, just bends." Elias swallowed, hard, like us. She smiled faintly, her eyes wet, her hand trembling in his. Like us. He sat with her until the sun dipped low, its reflection turning the river to fire. When she grew weary, he carried her back, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. That night, she did not rise again. In the quiet hours before dawn, Martha passed, her breath fading like the last ember in a hearth. Elias sat by her side, her hand still in his, the ribbon she once wore tucked gently against her palm. The rocking chair stayed still that night, as if even the house bowed in silence. The sock. Days that followed blurred. Elias dug the grave himself beneath the cottonwoods by the river bend. The soil was heavy, but he worked without pause, each strike of the spade a vow. He laid her to rest with her shawl folded over her chest, the ribbon at her side. When the last earth was heaped, he stood there a long while, hat in his hands, the river murmuring beyond. He felt the ache of solitude, sharp and endless, yet beneath it, something steadier, something she had given him without words. Grace. Seasons passed. The ranch remained, not rich, not barren, but alive. Elias carried on, tending cattle, mending fences, drinking coffee alone on the porch. The rocking chair creaked beside him, no longer haunted, only empty wood warmed by the fire. At night, he sometimes sat by the river watching it bend beneath the cottonwoods, listening to its endless patience. He grew old, as all men do, but he did not grow bitter, for he had known a love that was not chosen by passion or chance, but by endurance. A love that had shaped him as the river shapes the land, slow and steady, bending without breaking. And when his time came, those who found him said he was sitting in the rocking chair by the hearth, hat resting in his lap, face turned toward the river beyond the window. A faint smile lingered on his lips, as though he were listening to its song one last time. The river ran on, carrying the years, carrying their story, bending ever forward toward horizons unseen.